wrong in the communication system. Second question, do you regard the teachings of Ellen G., the interpretations of Ellen G. White of the Bible to be infallible? That is, the infallible rule of interpreting Scripture in your denomination. If, for instance, an issue comes up where you're debating something, and Mrs. White speaks on it, is that the infallible voice?
Is that the end of the debate?
Is that it? That question was conspicuously left unanswered. And I was referred to other materials which was were rather superficial. And I asked a third question, asked them about questions on doctrine and why the book went out of print. And since then, I have formulated now a whole new series of questions.
All right, we're going to get to those. What I would like to ask Dr. Johnson is, in my hand here, I have just a portion of the Seventh-day Adventist workers, the former Seventh-day Adventist workers, ordained ministers, professors, men and women that have been fired. And many of these folks have talked with me, many have talked with Dr. Martin, and the main thing that I keep hearing is that in some way they touched some of the doctrines of Ellen G. White. They disagreed from a biblical basis as far as they were concerned, and because of that they lost their job.
I've done a rather careful study of this myself. Remember, I was in seminary, I was associate dean. I know these young fellows. I've been in Northern California where we have had a number of our young fellows leave the ministry. I was in Australia in August and September of this year. In Australia, that figure is 60 total.
Well, I've got 100 that are actually documented right here to start with, and I'm sure I could get the others for you. I'd be glad to give you this list here of 100.
Is this from the United States, or does this include the figure from Australia?
These look like these are all the United States.
I'd be very interested to see it. So on my count, the figure in the United States is around 60 to 70. And in Australia, it is 60. This is an exact figure in Australia.
All right, well, let's
you need to remember that in any year, this is over a 4-year period, in any year in the ministry, there are young men and older men dropping out for various reasons. Now, I grant that the number is much beyond what we would normally expect. We also have to remember that the worldwide employee count of the Seventh-day Adventist Church is 60,000.
Well, the question I want to ask you is that why are the men, whatever that number is, it's substantial. The question is, why is it that these men that are basically feeling that they're holding with questions of doctrine, preaching the gospel, their conscience is held to the Bible, which seems to be part of the creed that you're holding there. Why is it that these men are being fired?
Well, I don't see it just the way you do. You set it up there, John. I grant you that in some places it may have happened the way you have described it. But I've talked to a number of these men, and they are leaving the ministry for various reasons. Frankly, many had a very strong attachment to Dr. Desmond Ford. He taught a whole generation of ministers in Australia. Here in the United States, he taught for several years out in the West. He's a powerful preacher, charismatic person, very fine Christian man. And his preaching has done much to revive this church, the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And some have felt sort of a sense of loyalty. And with Ford falling out of favor, his particular interpretations of prophecy and so on not being accepted by the church at large, they've identified with him.
Let me hold it right there with Ford, because we had Des Ford here, and when we had him here, I tried to push him as far as I could, and he would not in any shape or form try to dent the denomination. I mean, he was for it 100%.
Right.
He really talked a lot like Luther in the Reformation. He wasn't going to leave the Catholic Church. He felt like he was getting kicked out, okay? And in essence, he was trying to support it. He just felt that the view concerning the 1844 investigative judgment was not biblical. Spent pains here on the program, as well as at Glacier View and other places, to make that known. I've just listened to the debate that he had. And it seems like it's very, very biblical. Even if you disagree, is that a reason to kick him out?
Well, let's look at it from another perspective. We have a statement of faith. There are 27 articles in our statement of faith. Here is a minister who feels he cannot support our statement of faith in all articles. Now, the church members are paying his salary. He's being paid out of the tithe that they are putting in week by week, month by month. You see, here is a question of conscience on his part. There's a question of uneasiness on the part of members. The church undertook a large-scale study. It went to huge expense and brought in scholars and representatives from around the world, more than 100. We met for a week at Glacier View. We heard from theirs. We studied his views. And the church officially, in careful study, did not see light in his interpretations. Now, here's a man who is out of step in significant points with Adventist doctrine. And
where would you say, Brother Johnson, Des Ford's view of the sanctuary, 1844, the investigative judgment, etc., differs markedly from questions on doctrine?
Oh, I think there are certain important differences.
Where would you specify?
In terms of prophecy, now, Des, as I understand him, has basically thrown out the historicist school of interpretation. It is fulfillment either in the first century or right at the very end of time.
But that's not sufficient ground for disfellowship.
No, this is in terms of interpretation of prophecy, no. When it comes to 1844, as I understand him, he would see that in terms of its significance for something that happens here on earth rather than something that happens in heaven above. And that is certainly a significant departure from questions on doctrine.
Wasn't it part of the view all the way back to Ellen G. White that a person could disagree with the 1844 investigative judgment and that was not grounds for disfellowshipping? Wasn't this part of your literature?
It was pretty specifically stated that one by Mrs. White that you could have differences of opinion and even about her role of authority in the church. And she was the one who exercised the spirit of prophecy, allegedly. You could disagree with this and not understand this and not be disfellowshipped from the church, she said. Now, how is it that Ford, who has a very high view of Mrs. White, and who wrote probably one of your best books on the sanctuary, Yea, Thick, which you're still selling in some of your bookstores, Ford's own work on the subject, and you hailed him as an authority on the sanctuary and on the investigative judgment. And Ford comes along and says, well, after some very careful study here, and in the light of some of the things and questions on doctrine, I just don't happen to agree with this, and I'd like, to deal with this issue. And all of a sudden, it's far beyond, from what I'm getting in the mails, Des Ford and a group of men following Desmond Ford. These are people all over the place who are all having the same experience, and are all getting very frustrated because every time they start asking questions, they're not getting any answers on the subject, and it's very confusing. For instance, let me illustrate what I'm talking about. I met with a committee at Loma Linda University. A number of individuals were there of high rank in the Adventist denomination. Not to name drop, but Robert Olson was there, and Roy Anderson was there, and a few others. And I was very concerned about the specific issue about the investigative judgment, the sanctuary, and so forth, and particularly Mrs. White's role. And I asked the question at that time, the same question I asked the General Conference: is Mrs. White the infallible interpreter of Holy Scripture? And Robert Olson said, she is the authoritative voice. I said, infallible interpreter. That's the key. I said, because if Mrs. White is the infallible interpreter, and you cannot disagree with her on the investigative judgment,